Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to paint this watercolor peony piece, and I'm also giving it away to one of you because I have a special surprise. I have reached a really big milestone here on YouTube, and I have 100,000 subscribers because of you. You are here, you are watching, you're part of this community, and I am just so beyond grateful. I got emotional a little bit when I was opening this up. It's just a representation of lots of hours of work, hard work, and showing up for this community. So I wanted to say thank you by painting this watercolor peony piece, not only as a tutorial, but to give it away to one of you as a thank you. So details to enter the giveaway are in the caption below, and good luck to all of you. The paper I'm using is Bao Hong cold press watercolor paper. It's the Academy paper, so it's a little bit less rough of a texture. And I'm also using a Princeton long round size 8. I am obsessed with this brush lately. It does everything I want it to do. I pretty much use it for everything. And then for my tutorials, I typically like to use my Daler Rowney set of watercolor paints because it's just really easy to find the paints and to let you know the colors. As always with watercolor, we start with our lightest values of color. So I have picked up a rose color from my palette, and I've kind of mixed it with some bluish purple that I already had on my mixing tray, but I've added a lot of water because I want this to be a very light pale pink, and remember that it will dry even lighter than this as well. And I'm just focused on that front petally shape of the peony right now. I'm leaving only a little bit of white space. You don't have to leave too much. We are going to add in a lot of the shape with the details later. So right now I'm just focused on getting my main colors down in this light wash. Once I get the general shape and those main light wash colors down, we're going to add some darker colors for while it's still wet. But I did add in some cad yellow into my pink mixture on my tray, and I think this gives it a really nice kind of burnt orangey pink color that some roses and peonies have, like that transition from the light pink to the orange, just really subtle. And then I'm also bringing some petals really tiny around the back, like little tiny strokes around the back for those back petals, and then really big petals around the front for those ones that kind of fan out. So now while everything is still wet, we want to add in a higher concentration of pink. So I'm taking that from the well pretty strong straight into the flower while everything is still wet again, and it just creates a really nice bleed. I'm focusing this higher concentration of color around the general areas of where I think shadows would be. It doesn't have to be exact. Everything's going to dry lighter and more blended than you think it will, but I just want a little bit more depth of color when I go in to add details later. Now, depending on your area, how dry it is where you live, your paper will dry faster than mine or less fast than mine. You don't want it to be too wet because then the pigmented area that you're adding will bleed in too much. And if it's too dry, you won't get a nice gradual kind of ombre effect with the paint. So I live in Arizona. It's really dry. It's really hot. So my paper quality also determines how long my paper stays wet. But I also try to move really quickly and not overthink it so that I do have time to add in those higher pigmented colors. So I get a nice light to medium wash in that first laydown of color. When I don't want to overthink a composition, I usually try to do a really large flower, a medium flower, and a small flower. So I've done the really large flower. It's got a lot of petals, it's got a lot of layers, there's a lot of things going on. And then for this medium flower that I've got on the right here, I tried to keep it a little bit more simple, not quite as many layers, more fluffed out. So I'm trying to reflect that. I struggled a little bit with the shape at the top. I did not like it at this point. But once I fluffed it out on the left, I could see how the details were going to play out later when I add them in. And I started to see the vision. I'm like, okay, this is going to work out. I added in some of the darker concentration in the shadow areas, and then I just decided to leave it alone. Something to remember about watercolor, and I say this a lot if you watch my videos, there are so many ugly stages in watercolor. There are so many times where you think, this looks bad. Almost everything can be fixed with the details later, especially if you start with your lowest value of color, really watery, really light in the beginning. Almost everything can be fixed later with higher values of color. And for the smaller flower over here on the left, I tried to keep it a little bit more simple, smaller, again, less layers, but a little bit more tight because it's probably not as bloomed out as the other flowers. And now we're going to let the flowers totally dry and add the details later while we work on the greenery. So I am adding a ton of cad yellow to some bluish green mixtures I already had on my palette, but my favorite green mixtures usually include hooker's green, indigo, and cad yellow in different variations. For the stems, I'm using light pressure with the tip of my brush, and I'm actually using a darker value of color than I typically do. I just wanted the stems to be a good solid color, and then we can add darker values for contrast later. I've had a lot of questions lately about how to add organic greenery. Some people mentioned that, you're just flicking your brush around and creating this really random stroke pattern, but you get this nice greenery that has the effect that you're looking for. Well, I think part of it is a lot of practice. But also, you can go on a different piece of paper and practice flicking your brush around with really light pressure and just the tip and see what kind of strokes you make. I know that when I flick my brush in certain ways with light pressure on the tip to the first third of the brush, it's going to give me a specific look. I already know what it's going to look like. So I think that helps a lot when I'm creating these leaves going certain directions, looking flat, having a really loose, flowy, organic feel. I kind of just know what my brush is going to do. So practice mark making with the brushes that you have. That will help you so much. Try to get as much movement as you can with your greenery. You'll notice that with my stems, they are slightly curved. They're all ending at different heights. My leaves have curvature. I'm layering some of the leaves. I try to stick to the rule of thirds when I'm creating the small leaves that would be on a stem, like over here on the left, and really just figure out a way to move the piece along with the leaves. So I always paint the flowers and think, okay, these are the main focus, but how do I accentuate the flowers? It's all through the leaves. So I can feel when I'm looking at these leaves that I need one right here at the bottom. I need a big, beautiful center leaf, right? Kind of to match that big, beautiful flower there. And I can also feel that I need some more something on the right side where that pair of leaves are hitting, but I'm not sure yet what it will be. And then I also feel like the left side needs something, and I'll add that as well in a minute. But while this medium value of color that's really bright green is still wet, I'm adding in a lot of indigo green. So this is where I start adding a lot of indigo to my cad yellow to get this really deep dark green blue color. And I like to add that in while everything is still wet so I get a nice gradual bleed of color. I didn't plan out this painting before I started. I always feel like my best paintings are not the most planned out. And I didn't feel like I wanted more leaves on the left side to balance it out, but then I realized I could do a peony bud, just a circular shape with some white space to represent a bud, and then I could have one filling the spaces that I feel like are awkward on the left side and also bringing one coming out the top to really balance out all of the pink floral fluffiness we have with more greenery that makes sense for this piece. So I painted the peony bud the same way that I painted the leaves, where I started with more of a medium value of color, pretty strong green color, bright yellow green, and then went in and added an indigo mixture to give it a lot of depth. And then while I had that color on my brush, I went around and added it to other places on the greenery. And then I wanted to add another bud up here on the top because it really balances it out. I like to stick to that rule of like odds. So I did 3 flowers, and then I wanted to add 2 more pieces that are kind of the focus with these buds, but I didn't want to just do 1 or 3 because then I would have 4 and 6. So I added 2 so that then I had five main focal pieces, if that makes sense. That just is what's aesthetically pleasing to me. You can do it however you want. But I like the look of leaving a little bit of white space in the circular bud. I think it gives it a lot of dimension, and then using different colors to bleed and blend in while everything is still wet to give it that fun detail. Now, even though I said I don't plan out my paintings before I start, I do usually have reference pictures up just to give me an idea of how the flower sits, the fullness of the petals, how the leaves look, all of that kind of stuff. So when I'm looking at reference pictures, there's a lot of the time greenery or leaves that are laying really flat in the picture, and they look, really stick-like, maybe twig-like. So I like to go through in the final stages and add little bits here and there that kind of feel like little tiny bits, little areas of texture, leaves that are sideways, leaves that are kind of hanging out. I love using implied lines where you're not actually creating the lines where the leaf is exactly attached to something. I like leaving leaves out there to hang all the time. They're just hanging out by themselves in space because we use implied lines with our brain. We know it's attached. We don't have to actually attach it to a line. Now, you could just leave the painting exactly like this. You don't really need to add detail to the flowers. They're nice and light and beautiful as they are. But since we've added so much detail to the leaves, it does feel like the flowers also need the same attention. But I will admit, this is the scariest part for everybody, not just you. For the professionals as well, because you make one mess up with the darker contrasting colors and then it starts to look odd. But again, there's always ways to fix it, and I will kind of walk you through that process. So you don't want to start with your darkest values of color right away. I'm starting with my more medium values of color, medium to light, and I'm just trying to block out the shapes. So this technique is called negative painting. In watercolor, we cannot bring the lightness back. So when we are painting light things, like the petals of this peony, we actually need to paint darkness around the petals. So we are painting the petals by painting around the petals, which is negative painting. And so I'm using the medium value of color to add in shadows, but also to create shadows and depth and the rough edge of some of these petals. So I'm doing a lot of really quick strokes, and just kind of dabbing paint here and there. And very, very often in this painting, I am stepping back and standing away and looking at it from a distance to see how it's coming together, because sometimes you need a more distant view. And that really helps me to see anywhere that's starting to look a little too sketchy. Sometimes when we're adding shadows and details, it can be too pieced out, too separated. But if we have a little bit more of a base color with some lines coming off of it, it can look a little bit more organic. So for this medium value of color, I am taking just the pink rosy color that I've been using and using it in a higher concentration. So I haven't mixed anything into it to get it to this darker shade. It's just straight from the well. It's just more paint and less water. And then as I've already created those bigger shadow areas, now I can go in while it's still wet and tap in some of that higher concentration of pigment into those areas so we can have a nicer, more gradual bleed. Then I actually went and grabbed Payne's Gray, which is a beautiful color that leans blue, and I mixed that into the pink, and it's still very predominantly pink, but now it's more of a shadowy pink, and I've just again tapped that into the shadow colors just very lightly, especially where it's going to be very dark in the shadow areas, so closer to the middle where there's lots of layers, and that really bumped up the contrast, which made the shadows pop so much and made it stand out and look really beautiful. So if you can do this process really quickly, you can add that medium value of color in more larger areas and then tap in some of these contrasting colors while they're still wet, so you get a nice gradual bleed, and then just continue to build up that color in those shadowy areas, defining those paler highlighted petals, and then be done. Don't overwork it. And now it's just the same process over here for this flower. I started with more of that purpley pink contrasting color, and it was a little bit too dark, so I just grabbed some water and I was able to lighten that up and smooth it out really quickly. And again, just remember where we started, how these flowers really didn't look like anything, just really watery, big blendy blobs. And I was thinking actually as I was painting today that that's kind of how my YouTube channel has felt as it's grown to what it is now. That I started out with a lot of excitement, but I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know where it was going. And I was trying really hard, and there was a lot of ugly stages. A lot of times where it felt like nothing was happening, it wasn't working, and I hoped that I was providing my community with really valuable content that was working for them. And then it's like, as I just continue to push through and continue to paint, the picture starts coming together, just like how I feel like these peonies are starting to come together. And I start getting the feedback of how valuable the content is and how the community looks forward to my videos and how you're learning so much, which really is the goal. The goal of all of this for me is that I'm able to provide my community with watercolor techniques and advice and ideas that help further your joy in watercolor and your creativity and your skills. I feel like when I was starting out on my journey, I would have loved for someone to be giving me this kind of information. I feel like I learned it so much later in my journey and in my process. And anyway, I was just thinking how as these peonies come together and I'm starting to see the full picture, and my YouTube channel has grown to 100,000 subscribers, which is so amazing, that that everything happens in the right time, and the timing is right, and it was slow, and there were ugly points, but we made it, and I'm just really grateful for you and for you being here and for listening to me ramble right now. But the process of this peony is just the same. Adding layer by layer, medium value, darker value, contrast. I'm adding in some blues and Payne's Gray for the darker colors. And I'm just keeping this peony a little bit more simple. It's not quite as layered. It's kind of more full and wild, this one over here on the right. And it just has a completely different feel than that one on the bottom. Now we're going to work on this flower on the upper left. I started with a orange mixture for the shadows, and then I really did not like the orange feeling of it. So I just used some water to kind of sweep that off the page, and then I added a lot more pink to the mixture, and that was way better for me for this flower. I kept the details on this one very simple because it's the smallest flower. It doesn't need a whole lot of the shadow details to really stand out. It's also not the center of attention. It's kind of an accessory to the other two flowers that are very detailed already. So just a couple of simple shadow colors are perfect for this flower. Now the flowers and the greenery are done, but we're going to add a few finishing details that really bring it all together. I've got a really light pinkish orange wash, and I'm just kind of floating that color over some of the petals to get a really layered, textured look. Some of the petals just needed a little pop of a glazed color over the top. I did it really lightly, and I was really thoughtful about where I put them because I don't want to lose the lightness and the brightness in some of the other petals, so I was careful to stay away from some of those big, beautiful light areas. The peonies, the flower part, is completely finished. We're going to do some final touches on the greenery now. I mixed some indigo into the green that we had already on our palette, and I'm just tapping in some of this darker contrast of color at the base of the stems, around the leaves, just adding a little bit of that dark color here and there so that we get a nice contrast. You've heard me say this before, and I will say it forever. I always know when a painting is done if I can see the light, medium, and dark values in the object. So I like to have a really layered, textured look of the light, medium to dark represented in the paint strokes. So I'm just tapping in my darkest value. Adding it in really helps to bump up the contrast. When you have a lot of contrast, your lighter highlighted areas look even brighter. So that's the beauty of adding contrast to your paintings. When adding the contrasting strokes, the same techniques apply as when I was telling you about the brush strokes from earlier. We want to use really light, quick, kind of flick of the wrist strokes that will give you the most organic look. So I try to start with as little as possible. Then if I like it, perfect. And if I feel like it needs more, or I wish I didn't have it there, or I need to change it in some way, I can always kind of mess with it, move it around, add more if I need to. And now the painting's finished, it's done, but I had this idea to kind of create a highlight or a glow on the greenery by taking some really bright yellow paint, mixing it into the green so it's kind of a greenish yellow, bright neon chartreuse color, and adding it to the edges of the leaves, the edge of the peony buds, some of the stems, to see how it would look. And it looks really cool, I think. I mean, I really want to experiment with this idea more, but I feel like adding this bright yellow around the leaves and the stems made it look like the sun was catching on this greenery and just making it glow. And I'm going to zoom in here in a second so you can see it a little bit clearer. But I was really enjoying how this yellow green color looked around the stems because it's really hard to bring this glowy highlighted feel back into watercolor unless you have it at the beginning. So it's kind of fun to experiment with adding it at the end. And now it is signed and ready to be given to one of you. Again, I'm giving this painting away. The details for the giveaway are in the caption below. But thank you so much for being here while we painted this one. It was actually going to be hard to part with this painting. It's beautiful. I'm in love with this one. And I'm so happy that it gets to go to one of you, one of my 100,000 subscribers. Thank you, as always, for being here. I will see you in the next video. Bye.